The buoy had been in high orbit for 11 years before anyone thought to ask what it was. It did not broadcast. It did not blink. It simply hung there, 400 kilometers above the cloud tops of a world, the Galactic Registry listed under a designation nobody outside a records office had ever bothered to pronounce correctly. Sol 3. Population, unconfirmed. Threat level, historically listed as negligible, then quietly reclassified as unknown, then quietly forgotten again, the way bureaucracies forget things that are inconvenient to remember. The buoy was the size of a shipping container, matte gray, no insignia. For 11 years it did nothing at all. Ambassador Vell Threnyx Odai of the Takrul Compact had visited the edge of that system exactly once, 9 years earlier, on a survey mission that lasted less than 4 hours before her superiors recalled the vessel for reasons never fully explained to her. She remembered the buoy. She remembered how it had simply been there, unmoving, uncommunicative, and how the survey ship's navigator, a nervous young officer named Preth, had refused to fly within 50,000 kilometers of it without being told twice. She had asked him why. He had said he didn't know. He had said it felt like standing too close to something that was only pretending to be asleep. Vell was not a woman given to superstition. She had crossed 11 systems in a 30-year career, negotiated 3 ceasefires, and once talked a Yurkathi war clan out of glassing a moon over a border dispute involving mineral rights nobody could actually prove belonged to anyone. She trusted data. She trusted treaties. She trusted the slow, grinding machinery of diplomacy that had kept the Compact's 17 client species from tearing each other apart for the better part of 4 centuries. She did not trust silence. And Sol 3 was, by every measure the Compact's instruments could take, profoundly, unnervingly silent. No outbound signals, no trade requests, no diplomatic overtures in 11 years. Not one, not even the customary opening pleasantries that every species in the historical record eventually sent once they'd noticed they weren't alone in the dark. The species on that planet, humans, the file called them, in the clipped shorthand of a junior analyst who had clearly not expected the entry to matter, had detected the buoy. The instruments confirmed as much. Local orbital traffic had rerouted around it within 6 months of its placement, a level of precision that implied tracking, that implied awareness, that implied choice. And then nothing. No protest, no inquiry, no attempt at contact. Just a species that had noticed a foreign object watching their homeworld from a distance and had responded by going quiet and staying quiet for 11 years. The Assessment Council found this either meaningless or fascinating, depending on which delegate you asked, and on the 14th session of the year, they finally asked Vell to go find out which. She remembered standing in the chamber, the marble-veined floor cold through the soles of her boots, and listening to Grand Overseer Kestrel Voss, a man built like ceremony itself, robes the color of dried blood, voice pitched for rooms 3 times the size of the one he was standing in, declare, with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told no and meant it, that humanity's silence was an insult that had gone unanswered for too long. They do not respond, Voss had said, because they do not understand that a response is owed. He had smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that had never needed to survive contact with consequence. Vell had said nothing. She had only nodded and boarded her ship and set a course for a system that had said absolutely nothing back to anyone in 11 years, and found that the silence bothered her more than any threat ever had. Because threats, she had learned across 30 years of careful, patient work, are loud. They announce themselves. They want you to be afraid before they arrive, because fear is cheaper than force, and every reasonable actor prefers cheap. Silence, on the other hand, only means one of 2 things. Either there is nothing there worth answering, or there is something there that has already decided the conversation is over. She did not know, yet, which one Sol 3 was. She would. The Compact's flagship diplomatic vessel, the voice of measured concord, crossed the last 100 million kilometers to Sol 3's outer marker, with its running lights dimmed to standard approach protocol, its translator arrays humming warm, and its captain, a broad-shouldered Takrul named Oren Vask, a man who had flown this exact class of vessel into 4 first-contact scenarios without incident, reporting the kind of calm, unremarkable telemetry that made everyone on the bridge a little too relaxed. Vell did not relax. She stood at the observation window and watched Sol 3 grow from a point of light into a blue-green marble threaded with white. And she thought about the buoy, and she thought about Preth's voice 9 years ago saying, "It feels like something pretending to be asleep." And she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely uncertain. The ship's sensors painted the picture slowly, the way sensors always do, one confirmed data point at a time. Orbital density around Sol 3, moderate, mostly automated, nothing exotic. Surface energy signatures, consistent with a species several centuries into industrial maturity, nothing that screamed weapons grade, nothing that screamed anything at all really, which was itself strange, because every spacefaring species Vell had ever surveyed left some kind of signature bleeding into the void. A test range, a weapons trial gone slightly wrong, some old orbital debris from a war nobody talked about anymore. Sol 3 had none of that. It had a buoy, and around the buoy, at a distance of exactly 100,000 kilometers, not 90, not 110, exactly 100,000. The kind of number that told you it wasn't an accident, a boundary. Not visible, not physical. But the ship's threat assessment suite flagged it before Vell even asked, because the suite had been fed enough historical data on this system to know that no vessel, in 11 years, had crossed that specific radius and continued on its original heading. Every one of them had turned back. Every single one. "That's not a coincidence," said Vask quietly, reading the same data over her shoulder. "That's a fence." "Fences have signs," Vell said. "Warnings, broadcasts. This has nothing. Maybe they don't feel the need to explain themselves." Vell looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is what worries me." The voice of measured concord crossed the boundary anyway. Council orders were explicit. Establish contact, deliver formal notice of the assessment, proceed to orbital insertion regardless of local custom, because, as Voss had put it in the chamber, with that same easy smile, sovereignty was not something a species got to claim simply by being quiet about it. Nothing happened for the first 11 minutes after they crossed. On the 12th minute, 3 vessels decloaked in a loose triangle around the Concorde, close enough that their hulls filled the viewport, far enough that no reasonable observer could call it an act of aggression. They did not fire. They did not hail. They simply matched course and waited, with the unbothered patience of something that had done this exact maneuver so many times it no longer required thought. "Cloaking technology," Vask said, staring at the readouts like they'd personally betrayed him. "Sustained, undetected at that mass. We don't have anything that clean." "No," Vell said, "we don't." She watched the lead vessel, sleek, dark, unornamented, nothing like the polished ceremonial hulls of the compact fleet, hold position exactly 2 kilometers off their bow, and she understood, with the sudden cold clarity of someone who has just realized she has badly misjudged a room, that the silence had never been the absence of an answer. It had been the answer. Humanity had not ignored the Compact's presence for 11 years. They had been watching it, studying it, learning the shape of it, the rhythm of its patrols, the habits of its diplomats, the precise radius at which its instruments began to notice things. And they had done all of this so quietly, so completely without comment, that an entire council of 17 species had mistaken the discipline for ignorance. Vell had spent 30 years learning to read rooms full of people who wanted her to be afraid. She had never before stood in a room built entirely out of people who didn't care whether she was afraid or not. It was, she found, a very different kind of silence. A voice came through the comm, male, calm, unhurried, speaking the compact's trade tongue with an accent that placed the vowels a half-second later than they belonged, like a man translating in his head before he spoke, though the ship's linguistic suite flagged the translation as flawless. Not an accent of difficulty, an accent of choice, of someone taking the time to be exact. "You've crossed the boundary," the voice said. "That's fine. We expected someone eventually would." Vell stepped to the comm herself. "This is Ambassador Vell Threnyx Odai of the Cruel Compact. We come under formal diplomatic notice regarding the assessment of Sol 3's status within—" "I know why you're here," the voice said. Not rudely, not even coldly, just factually, the way a man tells you the time. "You've been debating it in your chamber for 6 weeks. Overseer Voss gave the closing remarks himself. Something about how silence isn't the same as sovereignty." Vask's head snapped up from his console. Vell felt something go very still and very cold in her chest. "You have been listening to our internal proceedings." "We have," the voice agreed, with no hint of apology and no hint of triumph either. Just the flat weight of a fact being stated because it was true. "For a while now." "My name is Halden Ross," the voice continued. "I'm not a diplomat. I don't hold rank in anything you'd recognize as a government. I was asked to speak to whoever eventually came because I was the one who suggested the boundary in the first place." "Then you will understand," Vell said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will, "that the Compact does not recognize unilateral exclusion zones around systems under assessment. Your world status has not yet been—" "Ambassador." Not loud, not raised, just placed, precisely, into the small gap where her sentence had paused for breath. "Before you finish that thought, I'd like to tell you something. It won't take long, and I think you'll want to have heard it before you say anything else you can't take back in front of your own recorder." Vell said nothing, which, she would later understand, was itself the correct answer, though at the time it only felt like she had run out of things to insist on. 11 years ago, Halden Ross said, we put a buoy in your orbital path. You called it unremarkable. Your analysts called it a relic, maybe a beacon, maybe abandoned equipment from a species that had moved on and forgotten to collect it. Nobody flagged it as active. Nobody flagged it at all, really, past a line item in a survey report that somebody's assistant filed and nobody read. That buoy has been recording everything that's passed through this system since the day it was placed. Every survey ship, every diplomatic packet, every private conversation your council held in chambers, you assumed were secure. Because you assumed, and I want to be fair to you here, it was a reasonable assumption given what you knew, that nothing from a world like ours could possibly be listening that closely. Vask had gone very quiet at his console. Vell did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the dark, patient shape of the lead vessel outside the viewport. You are telling me, she said slowly, that a species we assessed as pre-contact, non-responsive, and functionally isolated has been conducting continuous surveillance of the Compact's internal deliberations for over a decade. That's about the shape of it, yes. Why? There was, for the first time, a pause on the other end. Not hesitation. Vell would come to understand the difference well before this was over, but something more like a man choosing deliberately which true thing to say first. Because, Halden Ross said, 11 years ago, one of your survey ships came within 50,000 kilometers of a planet we hadn't finished evaluating you yet, and the ship's log, which we recovered later through channels I won't get into, included a line from your assessment council debating whether our species was, and I'm quoting this exactly, worth the diplomatic overhead of formal contact, or better cataloged as a resource pending future development. The silence on the bridge of the voice of measured concord had a texture to it now. Vell could feel Vask not breathing beside her. We decided, Halden Ross continued evenly, without heat, that we would rather understand exactly who was asking that question and exactly how they thought before we let them anywhere near an answer. Vell Threnyx Odai had negotiated 3 ceasefires. She had talked a war clan out of glassing a moon. She had built, across 30 years, a professional instinct for knowing precisely when the ground beneath a conversation had shifted without anyone announcing it. She felt it shift now, all at once, like a floor giving way not beneath her feet, but beneath the entire architecture of the room she'd walked into. "Show her," Halden Ross said, not to Vell, to someone else, somewhere else, in a voice gone almost gentle. "Show her what 11 years bought us." To understand what happened next, you had to go back. Not far, only 11 years, 3 months, and some number of days that nobody outside a very small circle had ever bothered to count precisely, though one man had, because counting precisely was the entire discipline his life had been built around. Dr. Imogen Kale did not look like an architect of anything. She was 51 years old, wore reading glasses she kept losing in her own hair, and ran the Seoul Defense Directorate's Long-Range Analysis Division out of an office that still had a coffee ring on the desk from a mug she'd broken 4 years earlier and never replaced. She had been the one who found the buoy first, not the physical object, which any half-competent orbital tracking station would have flagged eventually, but the pattern behind it. A stray telemetry echo, buried in 11 seconds of background noise from a routine deep space listening pass that resolved, if you filtered it exactly the right way and nobody else had thought to, into the unmistakable signature of an alien hull decelerating into high orbit. She had not gone to the press. She had not gone to the Security Council with alarm bells and demands for a fleet posture change. She had done what she always did, which was write a memo, 4 pages long, dense with caveats, and hand it directly to the one person she trusted to read all 4 pages before reacting to any of them. His name was Marcus Ilanya, and he held a title so deliberately boring, Director of Long Horizon Coordination, that most people who met him at dinner parties assumed he worked in infrastructure planning, which was, in a sense, exactly true. Marcus Ilanya had spent 30 years of his career studying not weapons, not fleets, not treaties, but patience. He had written, early in his career, a paper that nearly ended it, a quiet, unpopular thesis arguing that humanity's greatest strategic vulnerability was not weakness but eagerness, the species' deep hunger to be seen, to be validated, to announce itself the moment it had anything worth announcing. He had argued that the first alien intelligence to observe humanity closely would not be assessing its weapons. It would be assessing its temperament. And if that temperament read as desperate for contact, for approval, for a seat at whatever table existed beyond the sky, then whatever species found them first would negotiate accordingly, not as equals, as a resource, as a line item. The paper had been dismissed by most of his peers as paranoid isolationism dressed up in careful prose. Marcus had filed it away, kept doing his job, and quietly built, over the following decade, the framework for exactly the kind of response his critics assumed he was too cautious to ever need. When Imogen Kale's memo reached his desk, he read all 4 pages, twice. Then he made exactly 1 phone call to exactly 1 person and said 11 words that would end up quoted, much later, in circles far smaller than the ones that quote famous things, as the founding statement of the entire operation. "We don't answer yet. We watch and we learn first." The buoy went up 4 months later. Officially, in the handful of records that mentioned it at all, it was cataloged as an aging weather relay awaiting decommission, the kind of bureaucratic non-entry that ensures nobody outside a very small office ever asks a follow-up question. Unofficially, it was the most sophisticated passive intelligence platform humanity had ever built, packed with listening arrays 2 full technological generations beyond anything in public research literature, designed for exactly one purpose: to sit in plain sight, doing nothing anyone would find alarming, while it learned everything. Marcus did not staff the project with generals. He staffed it with linguists, behavioral analysts, historians who specialized in the collapse of empires that had underestimated a neighbor, a retired diplomat who had spent 40 years learning to read the difference between a threat and a bluff in rooms where the wrong read got people killed, a cryptographer who had cracked, for fun, 3 supposedly unbreakable ciphers before her 30th birthday, and found the actual work of studying an entire alien compact's diplomatic cadence more satisfying than any of them. 11 years is a long time to listen to a room full of people who don't know you're listening. In that time, the Seoul Directorate compiled a portrait of the Takrul Compact more complete than the Compact's own historians had ever assembled about themselves. Not through theft, not through sabotage, but through the simple, patient accumulation of every word spoken within listening range of a system everyone assumed was too quiet to matter. They learned which delegates spoke from conviction and which spoke from fear of losing standing. They learned that the Compact's 17 client species held together not through unity, but through a carefully managed hierarchy of resentments, each species reassured only by the knowledge that some other species ranked lower in the order. They learned Grand Overseer Kestrel Voss's exact rhetorical pattern, the way he built consensus not through argument, but through the slow, patient application of social pressure until dissent became more expensive than agreement. And they learned, with the kind of specific, load-bearing detail that changes what a plan is capable of, that Vell Threnyx Odai was the only member of that council who had ever, in 11 years of recorded proceedings, argued for caution and been right. "We're not building a war plan," Marcus told his team in the small, windowless room that served as the operation's actual headquarters on the day the buoy first came fully online. "We're building an understanding. A war plan is what you make when you've already decided the outcome. We haven't decided anything yet. We're just done deciding blind." Somebody on the team, a young analyst named Priya Okonkwo-Hale, barely 2 years out of her doctorate, sharp enough that Marcus had personally recruited her off a paper about deception detection in adversarial negotiation, asked the obvious question. "And if they come here planning to take instead of talk?" Marcus considered this for a long moment, the way he considered most things, without hurrying toward comfort. "Then we'll already know exactly how they think," he said, "and knowing how something thinks is the only real advantage that has ever mattered." He did not raise his voice when he said it. He did not need to. 11 years, 3 months, and, as it happened, though nobody had counted it aloud until this exact moment, 14 days after the buoy went dark and silent into orbit, Priya Okonkwo-Hale sat in the operations room aboard the very platform that had started it all, watching the voice of measured concord cross the boundary line on a screen that had once been theoretical and was now simply true. She was 29 years old. She had never expected to be the one behind the console when the moment finally arrived. That honor, by rights, should have belonged to someone senior, someone with gray in their hair and decades of exactly this kind of pressure behind them. But Marcus Elanya had insisted, 3 years earlier, that the analyst who had spent the longest actually listening to the Compact's proceedings should be the ones present at contact, because understanding, he'd said, mattered more than rank. So it was Priya who watched the alien vessel's hull fill the sensor feed, close enough now to make out individual plating seams, and felt her pulse do something complicated in her throat that no amount of training had fully prepared her for. "They're hailing," said the comms officer beside her, a quiet man named Devram, who had spent 6 years learning to imitate the Compact's trade-tongue cadence so precisely that his own recorded voice sometimes startled him on playback. "Patch it through," Priya said. Her voice did not shake. She was, distantly, proud of that. She listened to the ambassador's voice come through the feed, measured, careful, the voice of someone trying very hard to sound like she was still in control of the situation. And Priya recognized it immediately because she had listened to that exact voice in council session after council session for 6 years. She recognized the particular cadence Vell Threnyx Odai used when she disagreed with a room but had decided disagreement wasn't yet worth the cost of open conflict. It was, Priya thought, the voice of the only person in that entire compact who might actually understand what was about to happen to her before it finished happening. She watched Halden Ross, retired diplomat, sharp-eyed, 71 years old, the only person on the team who had insisted from year one that whoever spoke first to the compact should sound calm rather than triumphant, because triumph was a kind of confession. Deliver the first true words humanity had spoken directly to an alien council in 11 years of silence. She watched him choose, with visible and deliberate care, not to gloat. She understood in that moment, sitting in a windowless room 200 kilometers above a planet full of people who had no idea any of this was happening, that the entire architecture of the last 11 years had been built for exactly this. Not a moment of triumph, but a moment of clarity. A door being opened, quietly, by people who had spent over a decade making sure that when they finally spoke, every word would land exactly as intended and not one syllable more. "Show her," she heard Halden Ross say, through the comm, in that same unhurried voice. "Show her what 11 years bought us." Priya's hands were steady on the console. She began to send the data. The first file that reached the Concord systems was small, deliberately small. A single audio clip, 4 seconds long, time-stamped 11 years and 2 months earlier. It was Grand Overseer Kestrel Voss's voice, recorded in a session the Compact's own archives listed as sealed, saying, "Catalog it as a resource pending future development." Vell Threnyx Odai stood very still on the bridge of the Concorde and listened to her own council's most private deliberation, played back to her by the species it had been spoken about. And she understood, with the particular vertigo of watching an assumption collapse in real time, that every safeguard the Compact believed it had, encrypted channels, sealed sessions, the quiet architecture of diplomatic confidentiality that made the entire apparatus of council governance function, had been, for over a decade, transparent as glass to a species everyone had agreed to call primitive. "That's not possible," Vask said, and his voice had lost its earlier steadiness entirely. "Our sealed sessions run on compact proprietary encryption. Nothing outside the council itself has the keys." "You're right," Halden Ross said, and for the first time there was something in his voice that might, in a less careful man, have been satisfaction, though he kept it small, kept it contained, the way a man carries a full cup across a room without spilling it. "We never had your keys. We just listened long enough to learn your patterns instead. Every code eventually leaks something in how it's used, not just what it hides. Cadence, timing, who speaks after whom. 11 years is long enough to learn a language, even when nobody's teaching it to you on purpose." Vell closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, her voice was different. Not afraid precisely, but recalibrated. The voice of someone who had just updated every assumption she'd walked in with. "You are telling me," she said, "that you broke our encryption not through force, but through patience." "I'm telling you," Halden Ross said, "that patience is the only weapon that never shows up on a threat assessment, which is exactly why it's the one that works." More data followed. Not everything. Priya had spent 3 days, on Marcus's explicit instruction, curating exactly which recordings would be shared and which would remain forever inside a vault nobody outside the directorate would ever access. Because the goal, Marcus had said again and again, was clarity, not humiliation. They sent the recordings that mattered. Voss's dismissal, a budget session in which 3 compact delegates had debated, with clinical detachment, whether Sol-3's biosphere would be worth harvesting if the species proved insufficiently developed to raise formal objection. A private conversation between 2 junior analysts, casually certain that whatever lived on that quiet blue world couldn't possibly understand what was being said about it. Each file landed on the Concorde's bridge like a stone dropped into still water, and Vell watched the ripples cross the faces of her own crew. Vask's jaw tightening, the junior officer at communications going pale, the slow, dawning arithmetic of an entire species realizing that its private conduct had been observed, catalogued, and understood by the very people it had assumed were too far beneath notice to be listening. "Why show us this now?" Vell said quietly, "instead of simply refusing contact. You could have stayed silent forever. You clearly have the capability." "Because silence stops meaning anything if you keep it forever," Haldenross said. "At some point, a species has to decide whether it wants to be known or just hidden. We decided a while ago. We were only waiting for the right room to say it in." "And this is the right room?" "You crossed the boundary, Ambassador. You made it the room." Vell looked out at the dark, patient shapes of the 3 vessels, still holding formation around the Concorde, unmoved by any of the last several minutes, and she understood, with the specific, cold clarity of a diplomat recognizing a fact she would spend the rest of her career unable to unlearn, that she was not standing across from a species that had been ignored. She was standing across from a species that had, for 11 years, chosen to be underestimated on purpose, because being underestimated was the only condition under which it could learn everything it needed to know before anyone else realized the lesson was already finished. News does not travel through a compact of 17 client species the way it travels through a single nation. It travels in layers, official bulletins first, filtered and softened by whichever ministry controls the narrative that week. And beneath that, the faster, messier undercurrent of rumor that moves through comm relays no ministry has ever fully controlled. The official bulletin, issued 9 hours after the Concorde's first contact, was 3 sentences long and said almost nothing. Diplomatic engagement with Sol-3 has commenced. Ambassador Odai reports the population as technologically capable and diplomatically engaged. Further assessment sessions are pending additional data. The undercurrent said something else entirely. By the second day, recordings of the sealed council session, Voss's 4 seconds, verified, uncut, unmistakably his voice, had reached 3 of the Compact's client worlds through channels nobody could quite trace back to a source. By the third day, it had reached 11. Analysts on a dozen different worlds, people whose entire careers involved reading tea leaves out of fragmentary intelligence, sat in quiet offices rereading old survey files on Sol-3 with a very different question in mind than the one they'd asked the first time. Not, what is this species capable of? But how long have they been capable of it, and how much of what we said in front of them did we say believing no one capable was listening? On the client world of Ashari Prime, a retired signals analyst named Tobrin Keth, 78 years old, long out of official service, spending his remaining years exactly as he'd spent his working ones, obsessively rereading old intercepts out of habit rather than duty, pulled up the original 11-year-old survey report on Sol-3 from his personal archive and found, buried in an appendix nobody had ever cited in 9 years, a single line he had apparently flagged himself, back when he still had clearance to flag anything, and then forgotten entirely. Recommend continued monitoring. Absence of response does not indicate absence of comprehension. He sat with that for a long time, in a small room that smelled of old paper and older tea, and felt something settle in his chest that he did not have a tidy word for. Not fear exactly, something closer to the specific melancholy of watching a warning you wrote yourself get proven right decades after anyone, including you, had stopped expecting it to matter. "I told them," he said quietly, to no one, to the empty room, to the version of himself that had written that line and been ignored. I told them, and they filed it. This news broadcast on the Compact's core worlds framed it, at first, as a diplomatic curiosity, a quiet species finally opening a dialogue after a long, unexplained silence. The kind of story that filled airtime without threatening anyone's evening plans. But the framing shifted, hour by hour, as more of the sealed session recordings surfaced, as more analysts across more worlds quietly ran the same arithmetic Tobrin Keth had run alone in his small room. By the fifth day, the story running across half the Compact's networks was no longer about a diplomatic curiosity. It was about a species that 17 worlds had, collectively and for over a decade, agreed to underestimate, and that had spent that entire decade learning every single one of them in return. Ordinary people felt it before their governments finished deciding how to say it out loud. On Takrul homeworld itself, in a transit station 3 levels below the council chamber, a woman named Ressa Ol, a maintenance technician, 40 years old, entirely uninvolved in any of this, the kind of person history moves around rather than through, stood in front of a public news display and watched the sealed recording play for the 4th time that morning. Voss's voice saying, "Catalog it as a resource pending future development," and felt something cold settle low in her stomach that she recognized distantly as shame. Not because she had said those words, she hadn't. She'd never sat in that chamber, never had a vote, never been asked her opinion on anything the council decided in her name. But she had never questioned it either. None of them had. It had simply been easier to trust that whoever ran the assessment process knew what they were doing, and quieter still to never wonder what the process actually cost the people on the other end of it. She stood there long enough that the transit line behind her began to back up, and a stranger touched her elbow gently and said, "You all right?" And she said, "Yeah," in the automatic way people say things they haven't examined yet, and went to work and thought about it all day anyway. That was the shape the news took, across 100 worlds, in 10,000 small rooms nobody would ever put in a history book. Not panic, not outrage exactly, though there was some of that too, loud and short-lived in the way outrage often is. Mostly, it was a quieter thing, the particular, uncomfortable recalibration of people realizing that a story they had accepted without much thought had another side to it, and that the other side had been listening the entire time they weren't. Marcus Ilanya watched the ripple spread across the Compact's networks from a small monitoring station back on Earth, in the same windowless room where the whole operation had started, and said very little about it, because there was very little to say that the data wasn't already saying for itself. "They're not panicking," Priya observed, watching the same feeds, 3 days into what analysts back home had already started, informally, calling the reckoning. "I expected panic." "Panic is what happens when people think there's still time to prevent something," Marcus said. "This already happened. All that's left is understanding it." "Is that better or worse for us?" Marcus considered the question with the same unhurried patience he considered everything. "Better," he said finally. "People who understand what happened to them make better neighbors than people who are still afraid of what might. Fear fades or it curdles. Understanding tends to last." He did not say this with pride. He said it the way a man states a fact he has spent 30 years earning the right to believe. 4 days after first contact, Halden Ross delivered an address, not a demand, not a declaration of victory, though half the Compact braced for one, and some of its more excitable commentators had already begun writing the triumphant speech they assumed was coming. It never came. Instead, broadcast simultaneously across every channel the Seoul Directorate could reach on Compact networks, translated into all 17 client languages by a team that had spent 6 years perfecting exactly this kind of precision, Halden Ross spoke for 11 minutes, and every one of those minutes was built around a single, deliberate refusal to gloat. For 11 years, he said, his voice carrying none of the theater the council chamber's own speakers relied on. We chose not to speak, not because we had nothing to say, but because we understood that the first thing you'd learn about us would become the frame through which you understood everything after. We didn't want that first thing to be fear. We didn't want it to be anger either, though we had grounds for both. We wanted the first thing you learned about us to be that we pay attention, that we are patient, and that patience, in our experience, is not the same thing as weakness, though a great many people have made that mistake before you and paid for it in ways I won't list here, because this isn't a threat, it's a correction. You cataloged our world as a resource pending development. I understand why. You had no evidence to the contrary, and evidence is all a reasonable institution can be expected to act on. We're offering you some evidence now, not as an apology owed to us, as a correction owed to accuracy. We are not interested in dominating your compact. We watched you long enough to understand exactly what that would cost and exactly how little it would be worth. What we are interested in is being seen accurately, not as a curiosity, not as a threat, not as a line item, but as what we actually are, a species that took its time. That is, I think, the only claim we're making today. He paused, and in that pause, translated live across 17 worlds, something in the tone of the entire compact seemed to hold its breath. We are not asking to join your council, he said finally. We are informing you that the terms of contact have changed, and that we expect, going forward, to be assessed the way you would assess an equal. Because for 11 years, whether you knew it or not, that is exactly what we have been. He did not raise his voice once during the entire address. He did not need to. The first response did not come from the council chamber. It came, 3 hours later, from a small trade outpost on the edge of the compact's territory, a modest station inhabited mostly by the Ether, one of the compact's smaller client species. Low in the informal hierarchy Vell had spent 30 years navigating, the kind of people whose opinions rarely made it into official record because nobody with real power had ever thought to ask for them. An elder named Vey, matriarch of the outpost's oldest surviving family line, old enough to remember when her own people had first been assessed and catalogued by the compact 3 centuries earlier, watched Halden Ross's address twice in silence, surrounded by her grandchildren who did not fully understand why she had gone so quiet. When it finished the second time, she rose from her chair, walked to the small shrine her family kept in the corner of their modest home, a shelf holding nothing more than a carved stone marker and a bowl of still water, the traditional gesture of welcome her people extended to any guest entering their home for the first time. And she placed a second bowl beside the first. Her grandson asked her why. Because, she said in a voice worn soft by decades, 300 years ago, my grandmother's grandmother stood in a room very much like the one that species just stood in, and no one gave her a bowl of water. No one welcomed her as a guest. They cataloged her the way that man said, a resource pending development. She looked at the small stone marker for a long moment. I don't know what these humans will become, she said. I don't know if they'll be kind or cruel or something in between, the way most people eventually are. But they were owed a bowl of water the moment they walked through that door, speaking as equals instead of asking to be allowed to. Nobody gave my grandmother's grandmother that. I would like just once to be the kind of person who gives it to someone else. She did not live stream the gesture. She did not send it to any network. It was, by any measure that mattered to the wider compact, an entirely insignificant act. An old woman on a small outpost placing a second bowl of water beside the first, for a species that would almost certainly never know it had happened. But somewhere in that small, quiet gesture was the shape of the thing Marcus Ilanya had told Priya Okonkwo Hale 3 days earlier in the windowless room where all of this had started. That people who understand what happened make better neighbors than people who are still afraid. Somve did not understand everything. She understood one thing clearly, though, and it was, in its own small way, enough. She understood what it felt like to be catalogued instead of welcomed. And she had decided quietly, in the privacy of her own home, not to make anyone else feel that twice. The months that followed did not look like triumph. They looked mostly like work. The slow, unglamorous architecture of two very different systems learning how to speak to each other without either one accidentally recreating the mistake that had started all of it. The Compact's Assessment Council, stripped of the easy confidence it had walked in with, spent its first 3 sessions after contact doing something it had rarely done in Vell's 30 years of service: listening more than it spoke. Grand Overseer Kestrel Voss did not resign. The mechanisms of compact governance did not work that quickly, and perhaps, Vell reflected privately, that was itself a kind of mercy, because a man forced to sit through the consequences of his own recorded words, session after session, learned something a swift removal would have let him avoid entirely. He did not apologize publicly. Some habits of pride outlive the situations that built them. But he stopped speaking first in council sessions concerning Sol 3, and he stopped smiling the particular smile he'd worn the day he sent Vell out to deliver an insult he'd assumed would go unanswered. And for a man like Voss, Vell had come to understand, that quiet withdrawal was its own kind of confession. Vell herself was named permanent liaison to what the Compact's records now, carefully, called the Sol Directorate rather than Sol 3. A small linguistic shift that mattered more than its size suggested, because a directorate was something you negotiated with, and a 3 was something you cataloged. She found herself in the following year spending more time on Earth than in the council chamber that had employed her for 3 decades. She met Marcus Ilanya in person for the first time on a gray afternoon in a city she was told had once been called something else, before a war she'd never heard of had renamed half its streets. And she found him nothing like the architect of quiet menace her imagination had built in the weeks after first contact. He was mostly tired, kind in a careful way, a man who had spent 30 years building a plan he'd hoped he would never need to use, and who seemed, if anything, faintly relieved that using it had not required anyone to die. "You could have humiliated us," Vell said to him, over a cup of something bitter and dark that she had been assured, with a small smile from the woman who served it, was called coffee and was an acquired taste. "You had 11 years of material. You could have released all of it. You chose 4 minutes. Humiliating you wasn't the goal," Marcus said. "Understanding was. Humiliation just makes people defensive. Understanding, if you're patient enough about how you deliver it, makes people reconsider. And if we hadn't reconsidered, if Voss and the others had simply doubled down—" Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning his own cup slowly on the table between them. "Then we'd have learned that too," he said. 11 years taught us how you think, Ambassador, not what you'd choose. We never assumed we knew that in advance. We just made sure that whatever you chose, we wouldn't be walking in blind." Vell thought about that for a long time after the meeting ended, on the transport back toward the small orbital platform that served, these days, as the primary point of contact between 2 very different ways of being a civilization. She thought about Preth, 9 years ago, refusing to fly within 50,000 kilometers of a buoy he could not explain his fear of. She thought about the exact number, 100,000 kilometers, that had never been an accident. She thought, most of all, about the 4 seconds of Voss's own voice, played back to an entire council by a species everyone had agreed, without ever quite discussing it aloud, to consider beneath the trouble of real attention. It occurred to her, somewhere over the dark curve of a planet that no longer felt quiet in the way it once had, that the lesson humanity had chosen to teach was not really about power at all, though the Compact would spend years relitigating whether it should be afraid of that power. The lesson was about attention, about the cost of deciding, in advance, that some rooms simply weren't worth listening to closely. She did not know yet what humanity would become, out among the wider dark, now that the door between two civilizations stood open instead of merely watched. She suspected, though, that whatever it became, it would not make that particular mistake about anyone else. 2 years after the first bowl of water was placed on a small outpost shrine, Priya Okonkwo Hale stood on the observation deck of a station that had grown considerably since the days it operated out of a windowless room. Watching new arrivals cross the same boundary line, the voice of measured concord had once crossed with such careful uncertainty. The station was busier now: trade vessels, cultural attachés, a rotating handful of compact students enrolled in a modest academic exchange program that had taken 18 months of careful negotiation to establish and would, everyone involved understood, take considerably longer to feel entirely ordinary. Nothing about it moved quickly. Marcus had insisted on that from the beginning, that a relationship built on 11 years of patience shouldn't try to make up for lost time by rushing the next 11. She was 31 now, senior enough these days to have her own small team of junior analysts, several of whom had not yet been born when the buoy first went dark into orbit and had only ever known a version of the story already finished, already historical, already softened by the particular smoothing that time does to things that were, when they happened, considerably sharper. She still thought, sometimes, about the 4 seconds of recording that had started everything. Voss's voice, flat and certain, cataloging an entire species as a resource pending development. She had listened to it so many times during the original curation process that she could still hear the exact cadence of it without trying. The particular emphasis he'd placed on the word pending, as though the only real question in his mind had been timing, not worth. She wondered, sometimes, whether he ever thought about it now, whether a man like that carried the weight of a sentence, spoken carelessly in what he'd assumed was a sealed room, or whether men like that simply built new sentences and moved on, the way institutions tend to forgive themselves faster than the people harmed by them ever fully can. She did not know. It was not, she'd come to accept, really her question to answer. Marcus Alanya retired 18 months after first contact, quietly, without ceremony, the same way he had done nearly everything across his career. He did not give a farewell address. He did not sit for the handful of retrospective interviews that historians and journalists, in the years that followed, increasingly wanted from him. He gave exactly one interview to a small academic journal nobody outside the field would ever read widely, and in it he said one thing that Priya had returned to more than any other passage of the whole piece. "People ask me if I'm proud of what we built," he'd said. "I'm not sure pride is the right word. Pride implies you did something remarkable. We didn't. We just refused to be rushed into being known before we understood what knowing us would cost. Every species that's ever survived first contact with something stronger than itself has done it the same way. Not with bigger weapons, with better patience. I didn't invent that. I just made sure we remembered it in time." Priya had asked him, in the one conversation they'd had after his retirement, whether he regretted any of it: the 11 years of silence, the families who had gone their whole lives never knowing what their government was quietly building above their heads, the sheer scale of the deception, however carefully justified. He had thought about the question for a long time, in the way he thought about everything, and then he had said something she had never forgotten. "I regret that it was necessary," he'd said. "I don't regret that we did it well." She understood, standing on the observation deck 2 years later, watching new arrivals move cautiously across a boundary line that had once meant something closer to a held breath, and now meant something closer to a doorway, that this was probably the closest thing to a summary the whole operation would ever get. Not a triumph, not a victory lap, just a difficult thing done as carefully as a difficult thing could be done, by people who understood that the cost of being wrong about the timing would have outlasted every one of them. She still kept, in a small drawer in her office, a printed transcript of the very first exchange. Vell Threnyx Odai's voice, and Halden Ross's, the 4 minutes that had changed the shape of an entire relationship between two civilizations. She did not know why she kept it printed, in an age when nothing needed to be printed anymore. Something about paper made it feel less like data and more like memory. Something about holding it made the 11 years before it feel less like an abstraction and more like something real people had actually lived through, one quiet day at a time, without any assurance it would work. She thought sometimes about Dr. Imogen Kale, the woman who had found the pattern first, who still worked in the same office with the same coffee ring on her desk, who had never once asked for public recognition for starting the whole thing, and had never once seemed to want it. She thought about Tobrin Keth, the retired analyst on Ashari Prime, who had written a warning 11 years before anyone needed it and lived long enough, barely, to see it proven right. She thought about Somve in the second bowl of water, and the particular grace of an old woman deciding, quietly, not to repeat a mistake that had never been hers to begin with. None of them had asked to be remembered. That, Priya had come to think, was probably the truest thing about the entire 11 years. Nobody involved had built it to be remembered. They had built it to be right and to be ready. And if being right and ready happened to also become a story people told each other later, that was a consequence, not a goal. She stood on the deck a while longer, watching the slow traffic of two civilizations learning, cautiously, one crossing at a time, how to occupy the same sky without either one needing to catalog the other first. The boundary line was still there, 100,000 kilometers out, exactly where it had always been. Nobody crossed it carelessly anymore. That, she thought, was probably the point it had been built to make all along. Ambassador Vell Threnyx Odai kept, in the small quarters she maintained on the orbital platform that had once terrified an entire survey crew, a single object she had carried with her since the day of first contact, and never once explained to anyone who asked about it. It was a small data chip, unremarkable, containing nothing but the recording of that first exchange. Her own voice, Halden Ross's, the 4 minutes that had ended one version of the world and begun another. She did not play it often. She did not need to. She knew the shape of every pause in it by heart, the particular way Halden Ross had chosen, again and again, not to raise his voice when raising it would have been so easy, so satisfying, so entirely justified. She thought some nights about Preth, the nervous young navigator from 9 years before contact, the one who had refused to fly close to a buoy he could not explain his fear of, who had said it felt like standing too close to something, only pretending to be asleep. She had lost track of him over the years, the way careers scatter people across a lifetime of postings, but she thought of him often because he had been right in a way none of the council's analysts, with all their instruments and their assessments and their careful, confident file entries, had managed to be. He had felt the truth of it before anyone could measure it. Some things, she had come to believe, were only ever available to instinct first, and to data much, much later. She sat, on the evening she finally decided to write down some version of what she had learned, not for publication, not for the council record, just for herself, the private discipline of a diplomat trying to understand her own 30-year career in light of the one encounter that had reorganized everything she thought she knew about power. With the data chip resting on the table beside a cup of the bitter dark drink she had, despite herself, come to genuinely enjoy. She thought about the word the Compact's own file had used 11 years before any of this began: negligible. She thought about how confidently institutions could be wrong, not through malice usually, but through the simple human failure of assuming that quiet things were quiet because they had nothing to say. She wrote, in the end, only a single line, in careful, old-fashioned script on actual paper, the way Priya Okonkwo Hale would one day keep her own printed transcript in a drawer 2 systems away, both women reaching for the same instinct without ever having met. Silence is not the absence of an answer. Sometimes it is the answer, arriving early, waiting patiently for the rest of us to be ready to hear it. She folded the paper once, set it beside the chip, and looked out through the small viewport at the dark curve of a world that had spent 11 years being underestimated on purpose, and was now, cautiously, carefully, becoming something the rest of the galaxy would never again mistake for quiet. Somewhere below her, on a planet that had finally stopped holding its breath, an old habit continued without ceremony. A woman in a small office with a coffee ring on her desk, writing another careful, 4-page memo about something small enough that most people would never notice it, patient enough to wait, if she had to, another 11 years to find out if it mattered. It usually did. That, Vell thought, closing her eyes against the quiet hum of the platform around her, was probably the only lesson worth carrying forward. Attention, paid long enough, in silence, was its own kind of language. And humanity, it turned out, had always been fluent in it,